Hello and welcome to 101 with me, Mark Bichachi. And this week we are talking about a topic that has had tongues wagging for the longest time. This is the topic of debt, specifically the Kenyan national debt. Now, I'd like to just set some parameters right from the beginning so that we understand where we're going. Number one, I want you to understand that national debt is not the same as personal debt. That's not how it works. I'll explain it in this show, but I need that to be at the back of your mind. Number two, governments are not profit-making organizations. They do not exist to create a profit. They exist to ensure the security, the stability, and the economic success of her people, which is why the government, for example, maintains an army. It is thousands of people who are employed by our taxpayers' money, and they generally do not do anything until there's times of war. And therefore, I would like to disabuse the idea that the SGR for some reason is supposed to be instantly profitable for it to make sense as an investment for the country. That is not true. I'll give you a basic example. I am sure that on your way to your house, or indeed your grandmother's house, there is a road, tarmacked or not, that is maintained using taxpayers' money. I can assure you your house is not a factory, it is not making us money, but yet we provide for you this infrastructure in the hope and in the belief that as a state, when we invest in you, then your life is better and the country is better. Now, with that understanding, the first question that comes to many people in their minds is, why do countries need debt? And specifically, why does Kenya need debt? To answer your question, I must first start by showing you a list of countries that operate under a budget surplus. And here's the list. Now, if you look at that list, you'll realize one thing pretty fast: that most of these countries are oil-rich countries. In other words, a lot of their revenue comes from the ground which they occupy. So let's take Qatar for an example. It has a low population. It has high quantities of oil. These quantities of oil they sell are able to meet their budget without them necessarily going back to the people. And therefore, this is the ideal state. We all wish that we had some form of resource and a low enough population to make this a reality. But the majority of countries work under a deficit structure because the taxes they collect are not enough to meet the demands of a country. In fact, if you look at the number of the world's debt, in other words, the money the world owes, it reaches upwards of $2 trillion US dollars. Yes, you heard me right, 2 trillion. You cannot imagine how much US dollars. Now, that number should not scare you. We need to now figure out what is national debt and how is it acquired and why is it needed. Now, and I'll zoom in on our country of Kenya. Number one, Kenya is called a middle-income developing country, right? What that simply means is that we do not have the infrastructure and the economy necessary to be called a fully developed country. In other words, we have a deficit. One of the biggest deficits we have is an infrastructure deficit. In other words, our roads, our electricity, our internet connectivity, our trains, railway line, and all of that, there's a deficit. That deficit is a 25-year deficit. Yes, we need to catch up in terms of infrastructure 25 years. In other words, infrastructure-wise, you're not in 2021, you are in 1990-something. And that is critical for you to understand, because in as much as we have an infrastructure deficit, we also have what we call recurrent expenditure. Salaries, maintenance of all the things that we have as a country. So for example, we have chiefs, we've got teachers, we've got nurses. Those are expenditures the government has to spend money on in order for our country to continue to function. Now, each time we do a budget, we have a development budget and we have a recurrent expenditure budget, and because of debt, we also have a debt repayment budget. Put all those things together and look at the figure we collect from KRA, you realize that if we are going to develop as a country, we need to find extra sources of income. This is not only true for Kenya alone, it is true for many countries across the world. And therefore, Kenya finds itself in the unique position where it needs to put itself in a position where it's taking on debt. Now, like I said before, debt is not a function of profitability as it would for you as an individual or as a business. Debt as a nation is incurred based on the continued existence of that country in a peaceful and tranquil method where its people are able to continue generating income, and from that income and taxes, they're able to pay back the debt. That is how governments work. Now, the question then arises, and it's quite a quandary, that if we want to have all these roads we all enjoy, and have all this infrastructure we want to enjoy, and have all this CDF 100 million per constituency, how then are we going to finance it? Now, there are two main ways to finance budgets. Number one is taxes. And what does that mean? If we want to get better services and not borrow, then we need higher taxes. I'll give you an example. If you take a swing at any Schengen country, their taxes, and Schengen countries are those countries that neighbor Germany in Europe, their taxes are upwards of 50%. 50%, which means if you earn 1,000 shillings, the government is likely to get above 500 shillings of that money. But what then does this government give the people in return? They've got free healthcare. They've got free education all the way to university, and this is quality education. And if you take countries like Sweden, Switzerland, all of these countries put together, their taxes are high, but that's also because you don't need to spend money on your healthcare, you don't need to spend money on your schooling, the government takes care of that. But in Kenya, we are a developing country, and therefore the feeling and the political environment is not conducive for an increase of tax. I am sure you watching me at home or in your office, wherever you are, if you heard the government has increased taxes by 5%, even on a commodity you don't use, I am sure you would complain. And every time we see in the newspapers that there is increased taxes, we complain. And perhaps for good reason. You know, perhaps we complain because of the corruption, and we feel like we are raising taxes and there is corruption. But we will talk about corruption another time. Now, the other option is if the government cannot raise enough money through taxes, then the only thing left is to borrow. And that's what we are here to discuss. So how do governments borrow? Now, we need to be very clear that government debt does not come in one shade. It comes in very many different shades. One of those shades is local borrowing through treasury bills and treasury bonds. What these are is simply issuances into the Kenyan public saying the government needs 50 billion, 100 billion, whatever it is, to develop infrastructure, and they give you a treasury bill or bond and you buy it, and then after a certain time you are guaranteed to get your money back plus a certain interest. Now, this is the preferred mode of having debt. Why? Because number one, it is in local currency. Why is this critical? It is because then the government has control of paying back that money through its own central bank. I don't have time to explain how fiat currencies work. We will try and provide a link below. But you need to understand fiat currencies to understand why it is always better for countries to borrow in their own currency. And therefore, for you to understand the health of our debt situation in the country, you must look at what percentage of debt is dedicated specifically to local borrowing. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that out of 563 trillion shillings in debt, we must ask ourselves, what is the debt mix of that? Now, here's the thing. Our domestic financing structure is 30% treasury bills, 70% treasury bonds. Now, this is important because Kenya's debt is not all of it international debt. All right? Now, here's why this is important. It means that all the monies that we have that are local debt, and our GDP is, we are borrowing 56% of our GDP is what is in debt, so around 5.6 trillion. I'm taking the GDP figure to be 100 trillion shillings. Now, about half of that is local debt, meaning about 26% of our national debt, nearly half, is local debt denominated in Kenyan shillings, and therefore our central bank can handle it. Now that brings me to the second kind of borrowing, and this is international borrowing. Now this is very, very important because this is where the rubber meets the road, because most of this is borrowed in US dollars. Why is this critical? It is critical because we collect our taxes in Kenya shillings, have to convert it to dollars, and then send it outward. So the first thing we must be sure about is that our currency needs to remain stable against the dollar for as long as possible to keep our repayment within manageable terms. So for example, if a dollar moves from 100 to 110, we've just increased our debt outward without doing anything. It's just the numbers of the currency, and it becomes a big number. But the second thing that is important that you need to understand is that if the debt is going to be properly managed, we need to have more concessional debt and less commercial debt. Concessional debts tend to have longer repayment periods, and they also tend to have lower interest rates. So in terms of your debt mix, what do you want? You want a lot more concessional debt. That means mostly country-to-country debt, and a lot less commercial debt. Commercial debt is, for example, Eurobond. Eurobond was a commercial debt where you float your interest in the international market, and private firms and things like that loan you that money. That debt is usually stricter. The prepayment period is shorter. Now, we need to look at the numbers just the same way we look at the numbers of our bills, and I want to show you what is interesting. Our foreign financing sits at 28.3 of total gross financing, right? So that's much lower than the 56% telling you the rest is local borrowing, okay? Now, the maturity, the average maturity of the public debt sits at 26.2 years. So 26 years from now is the average debt and the maturity of when this debt will be, all right? The figures on external borrowing are this. 26% of this debt is concessional, 8% is semi-concessional, and only 4% is commercial. That's a good thing because it means we have managed to ensure our commercial debt is low. And remember, every time you hear commercial debt, it means higher percentages of payback, and it means a shorter payback period. Therefore, we've got much of our debt, international debt, being concessional. That is good news. What is the other good news? That Kenya borrows 38% of Kenya's financing needs from external sources, and only 62 and 62% from domestic sources. So what is our domestic mix? 62% of our debt, 62% of what we borrow is borrowed locally. Now, how is that good news? Number one, if you have the resources and you're able to invest, where is that interest coming? It's coming to you as a Kenyan. That's a good thing. Number two, we're strengthening our economy. Number three, we're giving our people a chance to invest in the country. So in other words, there is another way to look at debt. It is also a money-making opportunity for you. If you've got 100,000, 2 million sitting at home, take it, put it in a treasury bill, you will get back 6%, 10%, whatever is on that bill for that period, and it's guaranteed to come to you at the time it is stipulated. So debt is not always a bad thing. As you can see, it is also a business. In fact, small tidbit, many of our banks invest in treasury bills. Yes, the money you put in your bank, the bank goes and invests in these bills, and that's how they're able to give you an interest, a healthy tip for you right there. Now, who do we owe money to? That's the other animal in the room. Who do we owe money to? And the people we owe this money to is 2% of our debt, of our international debt, is to Japan, 2% is to France, and the IMF 3%, the Africa Development Bank 6%, commercial banks 11%, international sovereign bond holders 19%, China 21%, and World Bank Group 25%. This, my dear friends, brings us to a total external debt service of 265 billion Kenya shillings. The elephant in the room is, can Kenya pay back the debt? Because the argument that this debt is bad is hinged on the fact that Kenya may be unable to pay. Let's start here. From 2002 to date, Kenya has never defaulted on its payment. So if history is anything to go by, then Kenya is fully capable of paying the debt. Number two, much of our debt is in the Kenya shilling denomination, which means it is owed to mostly Kenyans, and it will be paid back in Kenya shillings. Can we afford to do that? The answer is yes. Now, the other thing is, what do governments give as collateral to debt? Now, the truth of the matter is many of our debts, especially concessional debts, are given because of the sovereignty of the Kenyan people. In other words, it is a trust mandate. Okay, there are countries that have defaulted on their debt before. Now, of course, the scary one is where a Chinese took over a particular port in an Asian country to ensure they're able to pay back their debt. Now, taking over means that the revenues being generated by that port were not going to the country itself, it was being taken directly to China. Is Kenya in danger of this? Not really. Simply because much of our debt, as I told you, is local. And then number two, also Kenya has never defaulted on its debt. Now, next time we will discuss what Kenya is doing to bridge that all-important infrastructure gap and see how infrastructure and debt marry. I hope you now understand the Kenyan debt issue, and if you have any questions, comments, please, you know what to do. Below. Subscribe.